I remember the early days like they were yesterday. We were young, in love, and full of dreams. I was just starting my career, and she was my everything. Back then, it wasn't about how much I could provide, but how much we believed in each other. We had a small apartment, a modest car, and a lot of laughter. I'd come home every evening to her waiting for me, sometimes with a warm meal, other times just with a smile that could light up the darkest day. We didn't have much, but we had enough. And we were happy, or so I thought. I remember the day we found out she was pregnant with our first child. She ran into my arms, crying tears of joy. We sat on the old couch, planning names and dreaming of the future. I promised her that no matter what, I'd take care of her and our family. That promise wasn't just words to me. It was a vow I intended to keep for the rest of my life. When our daughter was born, I felt a love I'd never experienced before. I held that tiny bundle in my arms, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the joy. She was perfect, and so was my wife in that moment. She looked at me with pride, as if I'd given her the world. And then, 2 years later, our son came along. Life got busier, noisier, but still, it was good. I worked hard, sometimes late into the night, but I never let that take away from my time with them. I wanted to be the husband and father they could depend on. I made it a point to be present. Weekend trips to the park, family movie nights, bedtime stories, I did it all. I wasn't the perfect husband, but I gave it my all. When my wife wanted to pursue a hobby, I supported her. When she wanted to redecorate the house, I tightened the budget and made it happen. Because that's what you do for the people you love. But over time, I started noticing the little shifts. At first, they were subtle. A sigh when I mentioned overtime, a fleeting glance when I brought home groceries instead of a surprise gift. I shrugged it off. I thought, maybe she's just tired. Raising kids is hard. And it was. Still, I noticed how her tone changed when she talked about our friends, particularly one couple. They were the power pair in our circle, the ones who always had the latest gadgets, the luxury cars, the Instagram-worthy vacations. My wife would tell me about their trips, their dinners, the gifts he bought his wife, just because. And then, inevitably, the comparisons began. "Why don't we ever go on vacations like that?" she'd ask, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I'd explain that we were building something bigger. "We'll get there," I'd tell her, one step at a time. But it never seemed to be enough. I'd catch her staring at their photos on her phone, a wistful look on her face. I'd try to snap her out of it with a joke or a hug, but the gap between us was growing, and I didn't know how to close it. One night after dinner, she sat across from me with a look that said she had something on her mind. I braced myself. "You know," she started, "I love you, but sometimes I feel like I'm missing out." "Missing out on what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "On life," she said, "on experiences, on feeling special." I was stunned. Hadn't I done everything to make her feel special? I thought about the nights I'd stayed up late helping with the kids, the weekends I'd spent fixing things around the house instead of relaxing, the little notes I'd leave for her before heading to work. But in her eyes, it wasn't enough. I didn't argue with her that night. I listened, trying to understand her point of view. I told myself I could do more, be more. For her. For us. So I worked harder. I saved more. I tried to give her what she wanted, and for a while it seemed to work. She smiled more, laughed more. We even went on a short family trip, just to show her that I was listening. But the cracks were still there. Looking back, I wonder if I was blind or just optimistic. I believed in the strength of our love, in the vows we made. I thought that as long as I worked hard and stayed loyal, everything else would fall into place. I couldn't see the storm brewing. In those early days, I was her world. Or so I believed. I was the man she chose to build a life with. The father of her children, the partner who stood by her through thick and thin. I didn't realize that somewhere along the way, I'd gone from being her everything to just another piece of the puzzle she was trying to complete. It wasn't all bad, though. There were still moments of connection, glimpses of the love we once shared. But they were fleeting, like whispers of a song you can't quite remember. And yet, I held on, because that's what you do when you love someone. You hold on even when it's hard, even when it hurts. So there I was, a husband trying his best, a father who adored his kids, a man who believed in the power of love and commitment. I didn't know then that my world was about to be turned upside down, that the foundation I'd built my life on was already cracking. But for now, in this moment, I was still hopeful. I still believed in us. Because love, in its purest form, is about giving without expecting. And I was willing to give her everything I had. I just didn't know if it would ever be enough. It was like a lifeline dangling in front of me. A new job offer that promised everything my wife had been longing for. Stability, security, and, most importantly to her, the kind of lifestyle that rivaled the friends she couldn't stop comparing us to. When I got the call, it felt like the universe was finally giving me a chance to silence her complaints and prove I could be the husband she deserved. The offer wasn't just a raise, it was a leap. 20 times my current salary. 20. I could barely wrap my head around the number. It sounded almost unreal, like one of those too-good-to-be-true stories you hear from a distant friend of a friend. But this wasn't just a rumor. It was real, and it was mine for the taking. There was one catch. There's always a catch, isn't there? The job involved extensive travel. It wasn't the type of position where I'd clock in at 9 a.m. and be home by 6 p.m. This was a role that demanded me to be on the move, meeting clients, attending conferences, and spending more nights in hotel rooms than in my own bed. When I told her about the offer, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Her face lit up with the kind of excitement I hadn't seen in years. She didn't even ask about the travel. All she heard was 20 times the salary. And suddenly, every complaint she'd ever had seemed to vanish into thin air. "Oh, this is it," she exclaimed, grabbing my hands. "This is what we've been waiting for." I smiled, her enthusiasm contagious, though a small part of me hesitated. I wasn't naive. I knew what the travel would mean. I'd be missing dinners, bedtime stories, school recitals. I'd be missing her. But I pushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself that this was the sacrifice our family needed. "You're okay with the travel?" I asked, needing to hear her say it. "Of course," she said, almost dismissively. "It's just a few trips here and there, right? And look at what we'll gain." She wasn't wrong. The money would mean no more budgeting every little thing. It would mean vacations that didn't involve a road trip to the nearest beach. It would mean designer bags, fine dining, and the kind of lifestyle she'd been envying for years. So, I accepted the job. The first few weeks were exhilarating. I was thrown into a world I'd only dreamed of. A world of corporate jets, high-stakes negotiations, and polished executives who spoke in million-dollar terms. I worked harder than I ever had, fueled by the thought that every hour I put in was for my family. When I came home after my first business trip, I brought gifts, small tokens from the cities I'd visited. The kids were thrilled, and my wife's smile was wide and genuine. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a hero in my own home. But as the weeks turned into months, the shine began to wear off. The travel wasn't a few trips here and there. It was constant. I'd barely unpack before I was repacking again. I tried to stay connected, calling her every night, FaceTiming with the kids, sending flowers when I couldn't be there in person. But no matter how hard I tried, there was always this distance. She started dropping hints about how much she missed me. "It's just so quiet around here," she'd say, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I'd remind her why I was doing this, but the reassurance never seemed to land the way I wanted it to. To help ease her loneliness, I bought her a small dog. She'd always loved animals, and I thought a companion might fill the void when I wasn't around. At first, it seemed to work. She'd send me pictures of the dog curled up next to her, tell me funny stories about its antics. But it wasn't long before those stories stopped coming. The dog, like everything else, wasn't enough. Her complaints shifted, becoming more direct. "You're never home," she'd say. "It's like I'm raising these kids alone." I'd remind her that this job, the travel, the late nights, the stress, was for her, for us. "I'm doing this so we can have the life you've always wanted," I told her one evening, the exhaustion heavy in my voice. "And what's the point of that life if you're never here to share it with us?" She shot back. I didn't have an answer. Looking back, I see now that this job wasn't just a solution to our financial problems. It was the beginning of a new kind of tension. The very thing I thought would fix everything was slowly pulling us apart. But at the time, I couldn't see that. All I saw was a man doing his best, and a wife who still didn't think it was enough. When I first heard about the yoga classes, I thought it was a great idea. She had been restless and unhappy for weeks, and I figured anything that got her out of the house and focused on something positive could only help. I even encouraged her. "You've always loved staying active," I told her. "Maybe this will be fun for you." She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like ages, it wasn't tinged with sarcasm or frustration. "You know, I think I'll give it a try," she said, her voice light. So she did. At first it was casual, just a few mornings a week. She'd come home refreshed, talking about the instructor's soothing voice and how much better she felt after stretching out all the stress. I thought this was progress, a step toward finding balance in the life we were trying to build. Then she started mentioning a woman she'd met in class. "She's so elegant," my wife gushed one evening as we sat together on the couch. "You'd love her, really. She's smart, funny, and so well put together. She travels a lot, too. Her husband is always away on business, just like you." Something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me, but I shrugged it off. "Well, it's good you're making friends," I said, forcing a smile. "It's important to have people to talk to." And talk to her she did. Before long, they were inseparable. If she wasn't at yoga, she was at lunch with her new friend. If she wasn't at lunch, they were shopping together, browsing boutiques for things I knew I'd see on our credit card statement later. At first, I didn't mind. I wanted her to be happy, to have someone she could confide in while I was away. But as their friendship deepened, I began to notice changes in her. Subtle at first, but unmistakable. She started dressing differently, more glamorous. Her outfits, once practical and comfortable, now looked like they belonged on a runway. She'd spend hours in front of the mirror, perfecting her makeup for just another lunch. Her conversations shifted too. She stopped talking about the kids, or the dog, or anything that connected us to the life we'd built together. Instead, it was all about this friend. What she said, what she thought, what she recommended. "She thinks I should try this new restaurant downtown," she'd say. Or, "She says this perfume is absolutely divine." It felt like this woman was taking up all the space that used to belong to me. I told myself it was harmless. Friendships come and go, I thought. She'd get tired of it eventually and come back to herself. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a phase. The turning point came one evening when I was home for the weekend. We were sitting in the living room, the kids upstairs asleep, when she brought up her friend's marriage. "Do you know she hasn't seen her husband in weeks?" she said, her tone somewhere between awe and envy. "But she doesn't mind. She says they've got an understanding. He does his thing, she does hers." I frowned. "What kind of understanding?" "Oh, you know," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "They don't cling to each other. They have their own lives. She says that's how she stays happy, by keeping herself entertained." Something about the way she said it made my stomach turn. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I didn't like where this conversation was heading. "Entertained how?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. She has her hobbies, her friends. She keeps busy. I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. There was something unspoken in her words, something she wasn't ready to tell me, or maybe something I wasn't ready to hear. From that point on, their friendship seemed to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just yoga and lunch dates anymore. They were going to parties, attending networking events, and spending entire weekends together. I tried to ignore the unease growing in my chest. I told myself it was good for her to have a distraction, that she deserved some fun after all the years of sacrifices. But the truth was, I felt like I was losing her. One night, as I lay in bed alone while she stayed out late at another one of their outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about friendship anymore. I wanted to confront her, to ask her outright what was going on, but I didn't. I didn't want to be that husband, the controlling, suspicious one who couldn't let his wife have a life of her own. So instead, I stayed quiet. I let her enjoy her newfound freedom, even as it came at the cost of our connection. Looking back, I realize now that this was the beginning of the end. This new friendship wasn't just a distraction. It was a gateway to something darker, something that would eventually shatter the foundation of our marriage. But at the time, I told myself it was just a phase. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The transformation had been subtle but unmistakable. Those who knew her, family, friends, even her yoga classmates, couldn't quite pinpoint when the change began, but they all felt it. She seemed lighter, freer, as though she'd shed some invisible weight. She laughed more, smiled wider, and her once restless energy now carried an air of mischief. Her newfound friend, the glamorous and enigmatic woman from yoga, had become a fixture in her life. Together they were a magnetic pair, two women who turned heads wherever they went. The glamorous friend had a way of drawing people into her orbit, her charm equal parts intoxicating and dangerous. And then came the confession. It happened one day after their yoga class. The two women sat at a cafe, sipping their lattes as they chatted about everything and nothing. Her friend, ever so casually, leaned in with a conspiratorial grin. "Can you keep a secret?" she asked, her voice low and teasing. The question hung in the air for a moment, tinged with intrigue. "Of course," came the reply, her curiosity piqued. Her friend chuckled, a soft, knowing laugh that hinted at something scandalous. "That phone call you saw me take the other day? That wasn't my husband." There was a pause as the weight of those words settled. "Then who was it?" she asked, unsure if she wanted to hear the answer. "My side man," her friend said, her tone almost breezy, as though she were sharing a favorite recipe or a good book recommendation. Shock flashed across her face, quickly followed by disbelief. "You're serious?" "Completely," her friend said, taking another sip of her drink. "And honestly, it's the best decision I've ever made. You wouldn't believe how much happier I am." The words lingered, swirling in the air like smoke. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Was this a joke? A test? But the look on her friend's face was one of pure confidence, even pride. "Why would you do that?" she finally asked, her voice hesitant. Her friend smiled knowingly. "Because I got tired of being lonely. My husband is always away, wrapped up in work." Sound familiar? She stiffened at the comparison, but her friend wasn't finished. "Don't get me wrong, I love my husband. But love doesn't fill the silence, and it doesn't warm the bed when you're alone night after night. Sometimes you just need more. Something exciting." The words resonated in a way she wasn't ready to admit. She thought about the long nights, the quiet house, the empty side of the bed. She thought about how she had poured herself into yoga, her dog, anything to distract from the loneliness. Her friend leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You deserve to feel wanted, don't you?" The question lingered, both an accusation and an invitation. At first, she brushed it off. This wasn't her. She wasn't that kind of woman. But the seed had been planted, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about it. A few days later, her friend brought it up again, this time with an offer. "I know someone," she said casually, as though suggesting a good hairdresser. "He's charming, successful, and, most importantly, discreet. If you're interested, I could introduce you." Her immediate reaction was to say no, to reject the idea outright. But she hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Just think about it," her friend said with a wink. And think about it. She did. The days turned into a quiet battle within herself. On one side, there was guilt, the voice reminding her of the promises she'd made to her husband, the life they'd built together. On the other, there was temptation, the voice whispering that she deserved more, that it wasn't wrong to want to feel alive again. In the end, curiosity won. The introduction was casual, almost absurdly so. Her friend arranged for them to meet at a boutique under the pretense of shopping. He was there, waiting, his confidence evident in his easy smile and the way he carried himself. He wasn't just charming, he was magnetic. He had a way of making her feel like she was the only person in the room, his attention focused solely on her. They started talking, at first about nothing in particular. The weather, the store's selection, little things. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken connection, a spark that felt both thrilling and dangerous. When he asked for her number, she hesitated for only a moment before giving it to him. The texts started innocently enough. Small jokes, casual compliments. But they quickly escalated, each message a little bolder than the last. He had a way of saying exactly what she wanted to hear, of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Before long, they were talking every day, their conversations growing more and more with each passing word. She found herself smiling at her phone, her heart racing in a way she hadn't experienced since her first dates with her husband. It felt wrong, of course, but it also felt intoxicating, addictive. She told herself it was harmless, just a bit of fun to break up the monotony. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. This wasn't just a distraction. It was the beginning of something she couldn't control. And though she didn't realize it yet, this choice, this man, would change everything. I came home that weekend with the usual excitement to see my family. Even after weeks of travel, stepping through that front door always felt like hitting a reset button. The smell of her cooking wafted through the air, the sound of the kids laughing upstairs. It was enough to remind me why I was working so hard. But something felt different that night. Office. She greeted me with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The kind of smile you give a coworker you don't particularly like but have to be polite to. It wasn't how she used to greet me, running into my arms like she'd been waiting all day just to hold me. I shrugged it off. Maybe she was just tired, or maybe I was reading too much into things. I kissed her cheek, asked about her day, and tried to slip back into the rhythm of family life. Over dinner, I noticed how distant she was. She barely looked at me, her attention fixed on her phone every few minutes. I asked her about it teasingly, trying to keep the mood light. "Who's got you so glued to your screen?" I said with a chuckle. She looked up, startled, and quickly put the phone face down on the table. "Oh, just a group chat from yoga. Nothing important," she said, brushing it off. Her tone was casual, but her body language wasn't. She was fidgety, her fingers drumming against the table, her eyes darting everywhere but toward me. I wanted to press her, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing, just her way of decompressing after a long day. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. But beneath it all, there was this growing sense of unease I couldn't shake. That night, as we lay in bed, I reached for her. It had been weeks since we'd had any real time together, and I wanted to reconnect. But she turned away, mumbling something about being tired. I didn't push. I never did. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of her laughter. It wasn't her usual laugh, the one that bubbled up naturally when she was genuinely happy. This one was different. Lower, softer, almost coy. I got out of bed and followed the sound to the kitchen, where she stood with her phone pressed to her ear, her back to me. She was wearing that dress I hadn't seen in years, the one that used to make my heart skip a beat. "Stop it," she said into the phone, her voice playful. "You're terrible." I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding. When she turned and saw me, she quickly ended the call, her smile dropping. "Oh, you're up," she said, her voice too casual, like she hadn't just been caught red-handed. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "Just one of the girls from yoga," she said, brushing past me to grab a cup of coffee. Her explanation felt wrong, like a poorly rehearsed line in a bad play. But I didn't press her. Not yet. As the weeks went on, the signs became harder to ignore. The late-night texts, the sudden interest in dressing up for errands, the way she started keeping her phone glued to her side like it held state secrets. And then, there were the absences. "I'm meeting the girls for dinner," she'd say, or, "There's a new yoga workshop I want to check out." I wanted to believe her, I really did, but my gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. One night she came home hours later than she said she would. I was waiting in the living room, trying to keep my anger in check. "Where were you?" I asked as she walked through the door. She hesitated just for a moment before giving me that same rehearsed smile. "I told you, the yoga workshop ran late. You know how these things go." Her words were light, but her tone was defensive. I nodded, not wanting to start a fight in front of the kids, but inside I was boiling. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind of night I'd been craving for weeks. The kids were at their grandparents', and it was just the two of us. She had spent the evening flipping through her phone, occasionally laughing at something on the screen, while I sank into the couch, pretending to watch a show I wasn't really interested in. I wasn't naive enough to think things were perfect between us anymore, but I was holding on to the hope that nights like this could remind us of what we once had. After a while, she stood up and stretched. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, her voice light. "All right," I replied, barely looking up from the TV. I heard her footsteps as she walked upstairs, the sound fading into the soft hum of the bathroom fan. I leaned back, trying to lose myself in the mindless chatter of the show, but then her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was instinct, really. I didn't mean to look, but the screen lit up, and my eyes caught the message. "Missing you already. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." For a moment, I froze. My heart started pounding, the sound of it roaring in my ears. I stared at the screen, hoping, praying that I'd read it wrong. But the words didn't change. I reached for the phone with trembling hands. The message was from an unsaved number, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a casual text from a friend. Curiosity and anger warred within me as I swiped to unlock her phone. The passcode was the same as it had always been. Another gut punch, as though she hadn't even bothered to hide this from me. The conversation thread was there, glaring and undeniable. My eyes scanned the messages, each one a knife to the chest. Texts, pet names, plans to meet, details about places and times that confirmed everything I feared. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was ongoing. I felt like the walls were closing in. My first instinct was to storm up to the bathroom, confront her right then and there. But something stopped me. What would that achieve? A shouting match? Denials? Excuses? I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I copied the number from her phone, carefully putting it into mine. Then I set her phone back down exactly as it had been and waited. When she came back downstairs, wrapped in her robe, her hair damp, she gave me a soft smile. "What are you watching?" she asked, as if nothing had happened. Just some old reruns, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. I didn't let on that my entire world had just shifted. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the dark, staring at the number on my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen for what felt like hours before I finally typed out a message. This is her husband. We need to talk. I pressed send and waited, my chest tight with anger and anticipation. It didn't take long for the reply to come through. Well, this is awkward, but sure, let's talk. What do you want to know? The audacity of it stunned me. He didn't even try to deny it or feign ignorance. How long has this been going on? I typed, my fingers trembling with rage. The response was almost immediate. A few months. She came to me, man. Said you were too busy for her, always traveling. Don't take it personally. She just needs someone who's there for her. I clenched my jaw, my teeth grinding as I read the words. He didn't apologize or show even a shred of remorse. Instead, he doubled down. You should let her be happy. If you can't give her what she needs, why stand in the way? It took everything in me not to throw my phone across the room. Who the hell did this guy think he was, lecturing me about my own marriage? She's my wife, I replied, each word a deliberate act of restraint. And this ends now. His response was mocking. Be a man, let her choose. Maybe you're not the right guy for her anymore. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with fury. My hands shook as I typed my next message. Meet me tomorrow, face to face. Let's settle this like men. There was a pause before his reply came through. Fine. Tell me when and where. I gave him the address of a cafe downtown, a place I knew would be quiet enough for the conversation I needed to have. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, my mind racing with questions, scenarios, and plans. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd built my life with fallen into the arms of someone else? And what the hell was I supposed to do now? The next morning, I acted like everything was normal. I kissed her goodbye as she headed out for yoga, just like I always did. But inside, I was a storm waiting to break. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where people came to enjoy a cup of coffee and read a book, not to have confrontations. I chose it deliberately. Public enough to keep things civil, but not so crowded that we couldn't speak freely. I arrived early, my nerves raw and my anger simmering just beneath the surface. I ordered a black coffee, barely touching it as I stared out the window waiting for him. Every second felt like an eternity, my mind running through what I was going to say, how I was going to say it. When the door finally opened and he walked in, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just anyone. It was my cousin. I stared at him, trying to process what I was seeing. He spotted me, froze for a moment, then gave a tight, almost sheepish smile before making his way over to my table. What are you doing here? I asked as he slid into the seat across from me. I could ask you the same thing, he said, his tone guarded. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between us. And then, like a dam breaking, realization flooded over me. You're the one, I said, my voice low but sharp. You're the one she's been seeing. He didn't deny it. I didn't know it was her at first, he said, his voice almost defensive. She didn't exactly introduce herself as your wife. My hands clenched into fists under the table, the effort to stay calm taking everything I had. But you knew eventually, I said, my tone accusing. And you kept seeing her. He looked away, guilt flickering across his face. Yeah, he admitted. I did. There it was. No excuses, no justifications, just the cold, hard truth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man sitting in front of me with the cousin I'd grown up with, the one I'd trusted. How did this even happen? I finally asked, my voice tight. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. She came to one of my hotels. he began, his tone resigned. I didn't recognize her at first. She said she was meeting a friend, but then we started talking. One thing led to another. I cut him off, not wanting to hear the details. And you thought it was okay to keep going, knowing she was married? Knowing she was my wife? He flinched at the anger in my voice, but didn't back down. I'm not proud of it, he said. But you're not exactly blameless here, are you? She told me how you're never around, how lonely she is. She needed someone, and I was there. The audacity of his words nearly made me lose it. Don't you dare put this on me, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I've worked my ass off to provide for her, to give her the life she wanted. This is her choice, your choice. He held up his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not saying it's all on you. I'm just saying things aren't black and white. Don't give me that crap, I snapped. You knew she was my wife, and you went ahead anyway. That's all the black and white I need. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, but then he sighed and nodded. You're right, he said. I screwed up. I should have walked away the second I found out, but I didn't. The admission did little to calm my anger, but at least it was something. What now? He asked after a moment, his tone cautious. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on his. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice low and firm. This ends. Now you stay away from her and you stay out of my life. Got it? He nodded slowly. Fine, he said. But what are you going to do about her? Are you going to tell her you know? I hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? I'd come here ready to confront him, but now that I had, I wasn't sure what my next move should be. No, I said finally. Not yet. This stays between us for now. He looked surprised but didn't argue. All right, he said. If that's what you want. It's not about what I want, I said, my voice hard. It's about what needs to be done. He nodded again, and for a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us both. I stood up, throwing a few bills on the table for the untouched coffee. Don't make me regret this, I said, looking him square in the eye. I won't, he promised, though I wasn't sure I believed him. As I walked out of the cafe, my mind was a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I found out about the party in the most casual way possible. My wife had been chatting about it for days, gushing about how it was going to be the social highlight of the month. She seemed genuinely excited, which was a rare sight these days. You should come, she said one evening as she cleaned up the dinner table. It'll be fun. A chance to relax, meet some new people, and just enjoy ourselves for once. I looked at her, trying to read between the lines. It wasn't unusual for her to drag me to these kinds of events, but the way she said it felt pointed, almost like a challenge. Who's hosting? I asked, keeping my tone light. Oh, it's one of the yoga girls, she replied, waving her hand dismissively. She's throwing this big get-together. Her husband's some big shot in finance or something. It's going to be amazing. Her enthusiasm felt misplaced, exaggerated even. I couldn't help but wonder if this was just another excuse to flaunt the life she wanted so desperately. The life she thought we were missing out on. All right, I said finally. I'll come. Her face lit up, and for a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I fell in love with. Great. You'll see. It's going to be a wonderful night. What she didn't know, what I wasn't about to tell her, was that I already had another reason for agreeing to go. Earlier that day, my cousin had texted me. She invited me to some party. Thought you want to know, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent the past few days trying to process the mess I found myself in, convincing myself that I could somehow keep things from spiraling out of control. But this was something else entirely. I didn't reply right away. What could I say? That I was furious? That the thought of the two of them in the same room made my blood boil? Instead, I waited until I was calm, or at least as calm as I could manage, before texting back. I know. I'll handle it. I wasn't sure what handling it even meant at that point, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them make a fool out of me. Over the next few days, I watched her prepare for the party with a mixture of disbelief and resentment. She spent hours picking out a dress, debating which shoes to wear, even booking an appointment to get her hair done. "You're really going all out for this," I said one evening as she stood in front of the mirror, holding up earrings to her ears. She turned to me, smiling. "Why shouldn't I? It's been ages since we've gone out together. Don't you think it'll be nice to let loose for a night?" Her words were innocent enough, but I couldn't help but feel like there was something else behind them, something she wasn't saying. I played along, pretending to be the dutiful husband, but inside, I was boiling. Every time I looked at her, I saw the texts, the lies, the betrayal. I thought about my cousin, about the way he'd sat across from me at that cafe, unapologetic and smug. And then there was the matter of her inviting him to the party. Was she testing me? Was this some kind of twisted game? Or was she so confident in her ability to manipulate the situation that she didn't think I'd notice? Or care? The night before the party, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario in my head. Should I confront her now? Should I call her out in front of everyone? Or should I wait, let her dig her own grave, and then deliver the final blow? By the time morning came, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much she'd hurt me. Not yet. If she wanted to play games, I'd let her. But this time, I'd be the one calling the shots. The day of the party, I watched her get ready with a sense of detachment. She was radiant, I couldn't deny that. But her beauty felt hollow to me now, a mask hiding the lies beneath. "How do I look?" she asked, spinning around to show off her dress. "Beautiful," I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. She beamed, clearly pleased with herself. "I can't wait for you to meet some of the people there. It's going to be such a fun night." "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. As we drove to the venue, she chattered on about who would be there, what the house looked like, and how amazing the food was supposed to be. I nodded along, barely hearing her. My mind was elsewhere, focused on what was to come. When we arrived, the house was just as extravagant as she'd described. Twinkling lights lined the driveway, and laughter spilled out from the open doors. She grabbed my hand, pulling me inside with an excitement that felt almost childlike. "Come on, let's find some drinks." I followed her, scanning the room for him. It didn't take long to spot him, standing by the bar, his expression carefully neutral as our eyes met. He gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "I see you, but let's not make a scene." I nodded back, my stomach churning with a mix of anger and anticipation. For the next hour, I played the part of the supportive husband, mingling with strangers, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny, and keeping an eye on her every move. She floated through the room like she belonged there, her smile bright and her laughter ringing out like a bell. She introduced me to people, bragging about my job, my success, as if we were the perfect couple. But all the while, I could feel the tension building, like a storm waiting to break. I caught her glancing toward the bar more than once, her eyes lingering a moment too long. And each time, my anger grew. She had no idea what was coming. As the night wore on, the air grew heavier, the lines between us clearer. She was playing a game, but so was I. And by the time this night was over, only one of us would come out on top. "Oh, there's someone I want you to meet," she said, her voice bright and casual. My chest tightened as she led me toward him. "David," she called out, her tone too familiar, too friendly. He turned, his face lighting up with a smile that made my stomach churn. "Long time no see," he said, his eyes flicking to me. "You must be the husband." There it was, the thinly veiled jab, the reminder that he knew more about my wife than he should. I forced a smile, shaking his hand firmly. "That's me," I said. "And you're—" "Just an old friend," he replied smoothly, his grin widening. "We go way back, don't we?" She laughed, the sound too high, too forced. "Oh, stop. You make it sound like it's been forever." I stood there watching them exchange pleasantries, their body language telling a story they didn't think I could read. She was nervous, avoiding my eyes, while he was confident. The room around us buzzed with activity, but for me, everything seemed to narrow down to the three of us. Eventually, she excused herself, saying she needed to find someone. As she walked away, I turned to him, my smile dropping. "This is a dangerous game you're playing," I said quietly. He didn't flinch. "I'm not playing anything," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "I'm just enjoying the party." I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists at my sides. "Stay away from her," I said, my voice low but firm. He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's between you and her. I'm not the one who's been neglecting her, am I?" Before I could respond, someone called his name, and he excused himself with a casual, "Nice meeting you." I stood there, seething, watching as he disappeared into the crowd. For the next hour, I stayed close to her, pretending to be the attentive husband while keeping an eye on him. She introduced me to people, laughed at jokes, and drank more than I'd ever seen her drink. But every now and then, I caught her glancing his way. It wasn't obvious not to anyone else, but to me. It was glaring. As the night wore on, the music shifted, and the dance floor filled with couples. She grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the crowd. "Let's dance," she said, her eyes sparkling. I hesitated. Dancing had never been my thing, but the look on her face was hard to refuse. "All right," I said, letting her lead me onto the floor. We danced for a while, her movements fluid and carefree while I tried to keep up. For a moment, it felt almost normal, almost like old times. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the dance floor watching us, his expression unreadable. Her eyes followed mine, landing on him. She hesitated, her smile faltering for just a moment before she turned back to me. "What?" she asked, feigning innocence. "Don't play dumb," I said, my voice quiet but firm. She laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I asked, stopping mid-dance. She rolled her eyes, pulling away from me. "You know what? I need some air," she said, walking off toward the bar. I followed her, my anger simmering. She ordered another drink, downing half of it in one go before turning to me. "Why do you always have to make everything so serious?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Why do you keep looking at him?" I shot back. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. "Maybe because he actually makes me feel like I matter," she said, her voice cutting through the noise around us. The words hit me like a slap. Before I could respond, she turned away, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on him, and she straightened, her expression defiant. "Don't you dare," I said, stepping closer to her. "Don't I dare what?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. "You know exactly what I mean," I said, my voice low and dangerous. She smirked, taking another sip of her drink. "If I want to dance, I will." "Not with him," I said, my chest tightening. She laughed, shaking her head. "You can't tell me what to do. You're barely even here." "Don't use that as an excuse," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I don't need an excuse," she said, setting her drink down and walking toward him. I grabbed her arm, stopping her. "If you dance with him, I'm walking away for good," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing with defiance. "If I want to feel wanted, I will," she said, her tone cold. The tension between us was suffocating, the music and laughter around us fading into the background. Everything came down to this moment, and I knew there was no going back. The moment she stepped onto the dance floor with him, something inside me broke. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching her spin and laugh as though I didn't exist, as though our marriage and everything we'd built together were nothing more than distant memories. I could feel the stares of the people around me, their whispered conversations piercing through the music. I wasn't going to give her or him the satisfaction of seeing me explode. No, that wasn't my style. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the party, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My chest was tight, my heart pounding as I made my way to the car. Once inside, I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as I tried to collect my thoughts. This wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. She didn't just cross the line, she obliterated it in front of an audience. As I sat there, the anger boiled over into clarity. There was no coming back from this. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly doubting, second-guessing, and playing the fool. She had made her choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer. "James," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning." "Of course," James replied. "Is everything all right?" "No," I said flatly. "But it will be." The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with everything I needed to do. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about protecting myself and, more importantly, my children. They didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of her selfishness. When I got home, the house felt different. Cold. Empty. I stood in the living room for a moment, looking around at the space that had once been our sanctuary. Now it felt like a battlefield. I went straight to the study, pulled out a notebook, and started making a list. Financial accounts, custody plans, property division. I wanted to be prepared for every possible scenario. If she was going to destroy our family, I wasn't going to let her take me down with her. The next morning, I walked into James's office with a folder of documents and a determination I hadn't felt in years. "I want a divorce," I said, sitting down across from him. James raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "All right, let's talk details. Is there anything specific you want to prioritize?" "Custody of the kids," I said immediately. "I want sole custody." James nodded, scribbling notes. "And the house?" "I want her out by the end of the month." He looked up, his pen pausing midair. "You're sure about that?" I nodded. She made her choices. Now she can live with the consequences. For the next 2 hours, we went through every detail, crafting a plan that left no room for negotiation. By the time I left his office, I felt a sense of resolve that had been missing for far too long. That evening, she came home from the party, her face flushed with what she probably thought was triumph. She didn't even seem to notice I wasn't there when she walked in. "Didn't think you'd leave so early," she said casually, kicking off her heels. I didn't respond. I just watched her, my expression unreadable. The next morning, the doorbell rang. She was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee when I handed her the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Read it," I said simply. She opened it, her face shifting from confusion to disbelief to outright panic as she scanned the pages. "You're divorcing me?" she said, her voice rising. I nodded. "You made your choice," I said. "Now I'm making mine." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't flinch. "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "This is my home. I'm the mother of your children. And you're the woman who danced with another man in front of me, in front of everyone." I said, my voice cold. "You're the woman who decided that her desires were more important than her family." "I was lonely," she shouted, the tears spilling over. "You're never here. You don't understand what it's like to feel invisible." "I understand betrayal," I said. "And that's what you've done. Betrayed me, betrayed our vows, betrayed our family." She tried to argue, to plead, but I wasn't listening anymore. "The papers are clear," I said, cutting her off. "You have until the end of the month to move out. I'll take care of the kids, and you can figure out what you want to do with your life. But whatever that is, it won't involve me." Her face crumpled, but I didn't waver. For too long, I had bent over backward trying to make her happy, trying to be enough. Now I was done. As I walked out of the room, I felt an odd sense of relief. This wasn't the ending I'd envisioned when we started our life together, but it was the one we had come to. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. After our confrontation, she barely spoke to me. It wasn't the cold silence of anger. It was the frantic, chaotic quiet of someone trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping away. Her face was tight with worry, her movements more hesitant, and for the first time, she didn't look confident. She looked lost. I wasn't sure how long it would take her to realize the full weight of what had happened, but I knew the moment was coming. That evening, she spent hours pacing the house, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. She was waiting for a call, a message, anything. Her alpha boyfriend, the one she had risked everything for, was nowhere to be found. I watched her from the doorway, leaning against the frame with my arms crossed. She hadn't noticed me yet. Her thumb hovered over her phone screen, her expression a mix of desperation and frustration. Finally, she stopped pacing, bit her lip, and dialed a number. I knew exactly who she was calling. She held the phone to her ear, waiting, and waiting, and waiting. The frown on her face deepened, and she pulled the phone away to check the screen. She tried again, her movements more frantic this time. When it went straight to voicemail, she let out a frustrated sigh and threw the phone onto the couch. "What's the matter?" I asked, my voice cutting through the tense silence. She jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Nothing," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "Doesn't seem like nothing," I said, stepping into the room. Her eyes darted to the phone on the couch, then back to me. "I don't want to talk about it," she muttered, brushing past me toward the kitchen. I let her go. She wasn't ready to face it yet, but she would be soon enough. The next morning, she tried again. This time, I watched her more openly, sitting across from her at the breakfast table as she scrolled through her contacts. She hesitated before pressing the call button, glancing at me as though to make sure I wasn't paying attention. I didn't say anything, just sipped my coffee and waited. The call didn't last long, just a few seconds of ringing before the automated voice informed her that the number was no longer reachable. Her face fell. She tried again, and again, and again, each time the same result. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. "Nothing," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. I raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, watching her crumble bit by bit. By midday, she was texting him, her fingers flying across the screen. I could see the hope in her eyes, the desperate belief that he would respond, that he would swoop in and save her from the mess she'd made. But no response came. She tried one more time, her message short and pleading. "Can we talk? Please?" I didn't have to see the screen to know the truth. He wasn't going to reply. He was gone, just like the life she thought she was building with him. Hours later, she sat on the couch, staring at her phone as though willing it to light up with his name. I walked in, my steps deliberate, and stood in front of her. "Still nothing?" I asked, my tone cold. She didn't answer, didn't even look up at me. "You're wasting your time," I said. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "What do you mean?" I smirked, shaking my head. "You really thought he cared about you, didn't you? That he'd be there when everything fell apart?" Her hands gripped the phone tighter. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," I said, my voice laced with disdain. "You thought you were trading up, didn't you? Leaving behind the man who built a life with you for someone who made you feel wanted for 5 minutes." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't stop. "Well, here's the thing," I continued, stepping closer. "Your alpha lover? He's done with you. Blocked your number, disappeared without a trace. And do you know why?" She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. Why? Because he never cared about you. To him, you were just another bored housewife looking for attention, I said, my words cutting like knives. And now that the fun is over, he's moved on. You're nothing to him. She broke then, the tears streaming down her face as she clutched her phone like it was the last lifeline she had. It's not true, she said, her voice trembling. It can't be true. Oh, but it is, I said, my tone almost mocking. And the best part? He's the one who gave me everything I needed to end this. The texts, the calls, the evidence. It all came from him. Her sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking as she crumbled before me. You've lost everything, I said, my voice cold and unrelenting. Your home, your family, and now even him. Was it worth it? She didn't answer, couldn't answer. She was too busy drowning in the reality of what she'd done, of the choices she'd made that had led her here. I left her there, broken and defeated, knowing that no amount of tears could undo the damage she had caused. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. This was the end of her game. And for me, it was the beginning of something new. The house was eerily quiet the next morning. I woke up early, as I always did, and made my way downstairs. She was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, staring blankly out the window. She hadn't slept. It was written all over her face. The puffiness under her eyes, the disheveled hair, the way her hands trembled as she held the mug. It all screamed of a restless night consumed by regret. I didn't say anything as I poured myself a cup and sat down across from her. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I waited, knowing she'd be the one to break it. I made a mistake, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I just stared at her, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. She looked up at me then, her eyes red and pleading. I don't know what I was thinking. I was lonely, and I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore. I leaned back in my chair, my jaw tightening. And your solution was to throw away everything we built together? To betray me, our family, for what? Her face crumpled and tears spilled down her cheeks. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to? I cut her off, my voice rising. What exactly didn't you mean to do? Lie to me? Cheat on me? Dance with him in front of me like I didn't even exist? I didn't think, she said, her voice breaking. I was stupid, selfish, and I wasn't thinking about the consequences. No, I said coldly. You were thinking about yourself, about what you wanted, about what made you feel good in the moment. You weren't thinking about me or the kids or the damage you were doing to all of us. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. I let her cry, my own emotions swirling inside me, anger, hurt, betrayal. But there was no room for sympathy anymore. I'll do anything, she said after a while, her voice hoarse. Anything to fix this. Please, just give me a chance to make it right. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. Make it right? How exactly do you plan to do that? Can you undo what you did? Can you erase the lies, the humiliation? Because I don't see how that's possible. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to take mine. I pulled away, her touch like fire against my skin. I love you, she said desperately. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't lose you. I can't lose our family. I stood then, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You already lost me, I said, my voice hard. You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't enough. The moment you let someone else into the life we were supposed to be building together. Her sobs grew louder as I walked away, leaving her at the table with her tears and her regret. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She tried to talk to me again and again, following me from room to room, pleading for another chance. Each time I shut her down. I didn't have the energy to rehash the same arguments, to listen to the same excuses. By the evening, she was a wreck, her once proud demeanor completely shattered. She cornered me in the living room, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she begged, her voice raw. "I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave me. Don't take the kids away from me. I'll change, I swear." I looked at her then, really looked at her. This was a woman who had spent so much time chasing after what she thought she wanted that she hadn't stopped to consider the cost. And now she was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. "I don't believe you," I said simply. Her breath hitched, and she sank to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please," she whispered over and over again. But I didn't move. I didn't comfort her. I didn't give her the hope she was so desperately clinging to. Because I knew, deep down, that this wasn't something she could fix with promises or tears. This was the consequence of her actions. And for the first time, she was finally beginning to understand just how much she had lost. The days following the confrontation were like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. The wife moved through the house as though she were a shadow of herself, her vibrant confidence replaced by a quiet, desperate energy. Every attempt she made to mend the damage was met with silence or curt responses from her husband. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't forgiving either. For him, the decision was clear. He'd spent years investing in their family, sacrificing time, energy, and even his own happiness to provide for them. And now, all he could see was betrayal. Her choice to shatter everything they had built together. The children, too young to understand the complexities of their parents' unraveling relationship, sensed the tension in the house. The once warm and loving home now felt cold, the laughter replaced by heavy silences and the sound of doors quietly closing behind them. She tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible to ignore the growing distance between her and her husband. The moments where they used to exchange knowing glances or share quiet jokes had been replaced by quick, fleeting conversations that ended before they could begin. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she stood in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. Her eyes lingered on a picture from their last vacation together, a snapshot of happier times when the smiles were real and the bond between them felt unbreakable. Her husband entered the room, pausing when he saw her standing there. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" she asked, her voice trembling. He crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "I think about it every day." "I never wanted this," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to hurt us." He sighed, the weight of his emotions pressing heavily on him. "You didn't mean to? That's the problem. You didn't think about the consequences, about what it would do to me, to the kids. You only thought about yourself." His words cut deeply, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. As the days turned into weeks, her attempts to reach out to him became less frequent. She realized that no amount of pleading or apologizing would undo the damage she had caused. Her husband had always been a man of action, and his actions now spoke louder than any words could. The divorce proceedings moved forward with a quiet inevitability. She signed the papers with shaking hands, each stroke of the pen feeling like another nail in the coffin of their marriage. Her husband, meanwhile, focused on creating a stable environment for their children. He poured himself into his role as a father, determined to shield them from the worst of the fallout. Though his heart was heavy, he knew he had to be strong for their sake. As she packed her belongings, the reality of her choices hit her with full force. The house she had called home for so many years, the life she had taken for granted, all of it was slipping away. She folded clothes into a suitcase, her movements mechanical, as tears streamed silently down her face. The day she left was gray and overcast, as though the weather itself mourned the end of their marriage. She stood by the door with her suitcase, looking back at him one last time. "I know I don't deserve it," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I hope someday you can forgive me." He didn't respond, his expression unreadable. He simply stood there, watching as she walked out the door and into the car waiting for her. As she drove away, she felt a crushing sense of loss, not just for the family she had broken, but for the woman she used to be, the one who believed in love, in loyalty, in forever. Back in the house, her husband stood in the now empty doorway. The weight of her absence settled heavily around him, but beneath the sadness was a quiet resolve. This was the end of one chapter, but for him, it was also the beginning of another. A chapter where he could rebuild, not just for himself, but for his children. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. The house was quieter now, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of tension anymore. It was the kind of quiet that came with a fresh start, the calm after a storm. The husband had spent the first few days after his wife's departure adjusting to the new normal. There were no more hushed arguments or tearful pleas, no more painful reminders of betrayal. What remained was a sense of resolve, a commitment to focus on what truly mattered, his children and their future. He threw himself into fatherhood with a renewed sense of purpose. Mornings became a flurry of activity, preparing breakfast, packing lunches, and ensuring everyone was out the door on time. He found joy in the little things, like his daughter's laughter over a silly joke, or the way his son beamed with pride after completing a school project. These moments reminded him of the life he was rebuilding, piece by piece. The children, though initially confused by their mother's absence, seemed to thrive under their father's unwavering attention. He made a conscious effort to be present, to fill the gaps left by the upheaval in their lives. He attended school events, helped with homework, and even learned how to braid his daughter's hair, something he'd never imagined himself doing before. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, the husband allowed himself moments of reflection. He would sit in the living room, the faint hum of the television in the background, and think about everything that had happened. There was still pain, of course, but it was no longer overwhelming. Instead, it felt like a dull ache, a reminder of the lessons he had learned. One night, as he sorted through a box of old photos, he came across one from their wedding day. His younger self stared back at him, full of hope and love. For a moment, he felt a pang of regret, wondering how things had gone so wrong. But as he set the photo aside, he realized something important. The man in that picture was gone, but the strength and resilience he had gained in the aftermath were far greater than anything he had lost. Meanwhile, his wife was navigating her own path. She stayed with a friend for a while, trying to figure out her next steps. The weight of her choices bore down on her daily, and she struggled to come to terms with the life she had destroyed. She missed her children desperately, but she knew that rebuilding their trust would take time. A lot of time. Every so often, she called to check on the kids. Her conversations with her husband were brief and formal, but they carried a mutual understanding. He didn't shut her out completely, but he made it clear that the boundaries were firmly in place. As weeks turned into months, the husband found himself healing in ways he hadn't expected. He started reconnecting with old friends, rediscovering hobbies he had set aside during his marriage. He began to feel like himself again, not just a husband or a father, but a whole person with his own dreams and ambitions. He even began attending therapy, something he had once dismissed as unnecessary. Sitting across from a therapist, he opened up about the betrayal, the anger, and the hurt. Slowly, he started to unpack the emotions he had buried for so long. Through therapy, he came to realize that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about freeing himself from the weight of it. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully forgive his wife, but he was learning to let go of the resentment that threatened to hold him back. One day, while picking up the kids from school, his daughter handed him a drawing she had made. It was a picture of their family, just the three of them, standing in front of their house, smiling. "Do you like it?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. He looked at the drawing, his heart swelling with emotion. "I love it," he said, pulling her into a hug. In that moment, he realized something profound. His family wasn't broken.